Hello again, everyone. In this video, we'll wrap up our coverage of the Plata classical variation of the King's Indian and have a look at White's alternatives to the big main three that we've checked. The classical with knight e1, which is by far the main line, the bayonet attack with b4, which is probably the most topical, and then knight d2, which was that old line that we just saw, where White is trying to get the knight to c4, but if we're accurate, he's unable to do so. And we have a very nice position. The moves that we'll see here are all quite rare, and I think in general we should be happy to see them. As you've seen, White in general needs to be very accurate and very concrete with his approach, or he'll get overwhelmed on the king side. Our play on the king side generally plays itself and a very dangerous attack. And so I think we should be very happy seeing any of these knight moves sidelines. In general, White's just getting a worse version of one of the theoretical lines. And our play doesn't change so much. We'll start having a look. And here, White has a few different choices. As a rule of thumb, it's going to be very difficult to remember exactly how to respond to each move. But if White keeps sitting out on f3, we should just remember, bayonet style, that knight g5 to e6 is still on the cards. Therefore, everything being equal, of course there's some differences, but all things being equal, we should put the knight back on e8, just to keep the bishop on c8 open, so that we've got control of the e6 square. It'll make it easier to play f5 without having to worry about knight g5 and into e6. There are a few moves that White can try that are likely to transpose with best play. They're just sort of tricky move orders. So yeah, if White keeps an out in f3, then in general we'll go back to e8 with the knight. If White moves the knight, in general we'll go knight d7. That is the most natural square, controlling the c5 square, where we have the fight, especially if we're going to get a transposition. For example, with bishop d2, this is probably the trickiest of them. White is trying to transpose, but also we can't put the knight on d7, or at least I wouldn't put the knight on d7 here, because the knight is still on f3, and White has ideas of knight g5 and hopping into e6. So we drop back to e8, but don't worry, it's still going to transpose once the knight gets back to f6. For example, White could go knight e1, f5, f3, f4. We're playing the same moves. Our knight might be on e8 rather than d7, but it's not going to make a difference because the knight will be coming back to f6 again. For example, after knight d3, knight f6, and we've transposed immediately into the mainline bishop d2 stuff. White could try something independent with g4, but we covered this position with a knight in d7, and it changes very little. Once again, we're fast enough with bishop f6 and h5 to create our counterplay before White has snapped the kingside shut with h4. So this doesn't work for White. And b4, we still just push on the king side. And once again, we're transposed to the knight e1 stuff. I can try a few different move orders. b4 is a bit trickier. Bishop d2 and b4, I said in the 9 knight e1 chapters, I didn't really trust as a combination, because the pawn on b4 gets in the way of the bishop on d2. But on d2, the only actually sensible square for the bishop to go to is a5. Put pressure on the pawn on c7. So b4 is blocking that plan. Here there's some logic to the combination. White's trying to keep the knight on f3 and also dissuade us from playing a5 because the bishop then will be usefully placed. But in fact we can just let the knight jump into g5. This would be a big problem if our knight was on d7, but with it on e8 there's no worries. Queen b3 has been tried, but we just come back again. We've got a lot of pressure on the pawn on e4, so White has to take, and here we can recapture either way. In general, as I said earlier, when we have the choice, I prefer to recapture with the pawn. Just that pawn's control more squares, and we don't run any long-term strategic risks. But taking with the knight and jumping into d4 is also perfectly playable. So both options are good. Knight g5 would be more challenging. It's the one move that we always need to check when we play f5, where the knight was still on f3. But we can just kick it away here. Knight e6 is the only coherent follow-up. Now white wants to jump a knight into d5, so we take away that square. And this e6 pawn is just very weak. We're following a game between Malcolm Payne, the English IM, an organizer, and Luke McShane back when he was a kid. But he was soon a very strong grandmaster, and he went on and won this game with black. What else can white try? Queen b3 is an odd-looking try, but it's been played by the strong GM Fedoseev. White's trying to stop us playing f5 because c5 then would be annoying. We can't take it because of d6. So let's just get the king off that diagonal. Now the queen just looks a bit odd on b3, and we're ready to push with f5. After rook c1, f5. Once again, knight g5 is the only move to check, but f4 here. I should make a brief timeout to explain f4, because I said that we should never play f4 when white hasn't committed to f3 yet. But there are two concrete reasons why f4 here works well. The first and most important is that the knight on g5 is now undefended, and so we threaten knight takes d5 with a discovered hit on the knight. The second is that with the queen over on b3, white can't play bishop g4, which is the main problem with playing f4 too early before white's played f3. Therefore, white doesn't actually have enough time to take control of these light squares that we're temporarily offering. If the knight just drops back to f3, then we'll just be able to start attacking on the king side very fast. There'll be no logic to white's previous moves at all. And jumping in doesn't really help either. We can simply defend the pawn on b7, and once again this pawn is very weak on e6, and we're ready to hop our knight into a very nice outpost on d4. So queen b3 is sort of a one-trick pony. White wants to play c5 to slow up f5, but as long as we're careful with king h8, there's no problem. So rook c1 is the trickiest try. White is playing the useful moves and keeping the knight on f3 for as long as possible. But it's time to play f5 anyway. Once again, if white takes, we have the choice between recapturing with knight or pawn. And I prefer the pawn. I like having complete control of so many central squares. And our knights have logical squares on f6 and g6 to hop to. Once again, the critical try is white coming into e6. But we can hit this pawn. What white should probably do here is play knight d5. But when we take the pawn e6, he's still scrambling to show any compensation for the sacrificed pawn. Mark Taimanov against Bobby Fischer played queen b3, trying tactically to hold on to this pawn. But the future world champion became world champion the following year to this game. Quickly took over. c6, just now preventing knight d5. The d5 square was sort of white's big hope once he's gone. Knight e6. If you recall back to the bayonet chapter, I said that this structure is extremely dangerous if our pawn is on c5 already, because white has this big outpost on d5. But when the pawn's on c7, it's a lot less worrying. White has basically sacrificed a pawn for this, with such a weak pawn on e6. Taimanov tried to keep defending the pawn tactically. His idea is to play bishop f7 check to defend it. So time to take. White succeeded in it just being a pawn exchange, but he's losing a lot of time. And in fact, the b2 pawn dropped. Fischer was a clear pawn up and went on to win. White could also try knight g5 without the exchange on f5. That play isn't so different. After the exchange here, Fischer played queen c8, if you recall, hitting the pawn immediately. But right here, queen c8 is a bit early because white has ideas of c5, and with the pawn still on the board, it's a bit looser our position. White has better control of the d5 square. So we'll play c6 immediately to stop the knight jump. Queen b3. The same plan as Taimanov chose. And here we just need to be a bit careful again. that queen c8, c5 is awkward. This wouldn't have been awkward in the Fischer position because the e and g pawns were already exchanged, and so here you could play d5 and keep your center intact. But now we can't play d5 because the pawn is attacked too much. So with c5, white would keep this pawn on e6 and damage our structure. So be careful. That's sort of white's only trick here. Instead, we'll play knight c7, so that c5, d5 is fine for us. White can collect the pawn on b7, but he's temporarily 2 pawns up, but our piece is so active, the pawn is still dropping on e6. And this is a beautiful center we've got with pawns on e5 and d5. So the whole line, again, just doesn't work for white. Just be careful about allowing c5. We want to be able to react with d5. But bishop d2 is a tricky try, keeping the option of knight g5, at least. Bishop e3 is an odd move order to get a sort of classical Gligerich hybrid. Now we should be a bit careful. We don't want to allow white to play knight d2. White's got very good coordination. If you remember the lines where white goes immediately knight d2, a big problem is that bishop is kind of useless on c1. It's blocked in by the knight on d2 and it just gets in the way. It means that the rook is undefended on a1. So if white gets time to go knight d2 here, he's got very good coordination. So we should chivvy that bishop away. Now, normally white drops back to d2 immediately. If he goes to g5, here going to d2 will just be the same thing. We'll play f5 and we both spent a tempo more, but it's exactly the same position. And if he goes back to h4, we've actually transposed directly to the Gligerich variation that we'll analyze later in the video. So the bishop drops back and we push with f5. And once again, the only way that white can try and exploit this move order is to get a knight landing in on e6. But it's not scary once again. One other thing to be aware of is white can, so knight g5 will simply transpose. White can try knight h4. Now, the idea behind this is to put a bit of pressure on the pawn on f5. So, for example, knight takes f5 is probably an immediate threat here because our knight is a bit loose. And so we should retreat the knight. Now, I think it's stronger to go slightly oddly to h6 just to keep the f5 pawn nice and secure. The point is that after f4, which is white's idea behind putting the knight on h4, he's fighting back on the king side. If he doesn't play f4, then well, we can just play f4 ourselves and put a knight in f5, exchange those knights and put a knight in on d4. And we've taken over. f3 becomes a big threat. And we've seen that structure a couple times before, that if white has to play f3, then our pawns on e5 and f4 dominate, and we're ready just to attack down the g-file. It's a very ready-made, quick, and dangerous attack. So f4 is the idea to stop us attacking. Now, we can just play knight g6. If this knight on h6 was on f6, white would be able to play fe here, which would be a bit annoying. We could take on h4, but he takes f6 and our structure's damaged. And if we recapture on e5, then our pawn on f5 is hanging because our knight on f6 is in the way. Here, fe isn't playable because the knight is hanging, but anyway, we're controlling the f5 pawn adequately. So that is why we should drop back to h6 against knight h4. It's just that concrete reason. Now going back to e1 is just ridiculous here. It's seen quite frequently, but this position, we just a tempo up on the main lines of 9 knight e1 that we saw. White can't afford to give up a tempo. Our attack is coming very, very fast. White can try knight h4 here as well. With a similar plan, we've seen it after the pawns have been exchanged. Here it's exactly the same. And so I would recommend to come back to h6. In fact, you can also go to f6 here, but after ef. Instead of allowing this g takes f6, f4, which is a bit of an unpleasant bind, you should take with the knight. Get rid of the knight and then recapture the pawn next. But still, I think knight h6 is easiest if we just remember as a rule to meet knight h4 with knight h6 to make sure our pawn stays safe. And in a recent email game, white couldn't find anything better than just repeating with knight f3 here, when, of course, we could play knight g4 if we wanted and ask white if he's trying to find anything more than a draw. We could also just play king h8 and go, okay, what exactly are you doing, white? You just seem to have given us some extra tempi on the king side, which we'll take and kickstart our attack, thanks. So these are kind of artificial moves, knight h4. There's one concrete reason to play it, but as long as we're careful, then we're just going to end up on top. So knight g5 is more sensible. In general, this, I'll keep reiterating, the point of delaying knight e1 or knight e2 for white is to have the possibility, at least, of playing knight g5 when we play f5. Now we can drop back, and this position is actually very similar to a mainline bayonet that I'm not recommending, where the knight goes to h5 and comes back to f6. But there, white has a better version. For one thing, it being a bayonet, this pawn is already on b4. And white has also played the slightly subtle, I think it's rook e1 in the bayonet, with the bishop back on c1. So white b4 is a general, definitely useful move. Rook e1 is probably a useful move. But we can be gracious to white and claim we're only half a tempo up, although it's probably just a full tempo on a mainline bayonet. But it's quite an important one, as you'll see, because white relies on this pawn being on b4 to create counterplay after he sacrifices a pawn with knight e6. And see how it works. First of all, white can't jump in with knight e6 immediately because we take and the e4 pawn is hanging. So he normally defends that somehow, or exchanges. f3 is the main move defending the pawn. He could take as well. We just recapture. After f4, we can ask the knight the question. Again, the only critical tries to jump in, but we exchange and we're ready to pick up the pawn. f4 hasn't really helped in the battle for keeping the e6 pawn. So queen b3 is tried. When f4 is a nice move, the point is just we're getting ready to activate this knight. Hop it round to d4. A bonus once we play knight f5 is that the knight on g5 will be hanging, will be threatening something like knight takes d5 with a discovered attack on that knight. White goes for c5 to open up, make use of this queen on b3 down to our king, so let's just get out of the way. And next we're ready to play knight f5 to d4, and we're doing well. The knight's going to land on d4 with tempo, hitting this queen back. Once again, white's line is just a few tricks that if we navigate them, we're doing extremely well. Bishop f3 is a main move in the bayonet, so it's worth checking it here. Remember, that would be with the pawn on b4 and rook on e1, and bishop back on c1. But the point is, after c6, here the critical move in the bayonet is to play b5, which is rather illegal here. And so white isn't actually in time to put the pressure on the center that he would do in the bayonet. You could try queen b3, but again, we can just challenge this knight. We've got the perfect structure with the pawn on c6 already, so there's no knight landing in on d5. Queen c8 defends the pawn on b7 and attacks the one on e6. Here c5 isn't working for white. I'll just check why. But we can take on e4 and take on f3. White can take on e7, but rook e8 and those pawns are dropping. And if we get time to play d5, then our center is fantastic. These pawns on d5 and e5. So we're just going to win the e6 pawn here. So bishop f3 doesn't work in this line. f3 can be played to hold it instead. And let's just play a generally useful move with king h8. As you can see, white's counterplay is always along the a2 to j8 diagonal. He goes queen b3, and once knight 6 has happened, he hopes for some tricks on that diagonal. So if we get the king off there first, then we can follow up with the next useful move of c6. And then we've got the perfect structure. So we can then go h6 and hit this knight. white has to go knight e6, or the whole thing is a failure of strategy. When we take it and play queen c8 and our pieces are well placed, white just doesn't have compensation for the pawn. So that's this interesting Gligorich hybrid with bishop e3. If white plays it objectively, he should just transpose to the Gligorich, although there are some questions on why he chose this move order. What else can white try? a4 is probably the most sensible move, not covered in those three. The main three, I mean, with knight e1, knight d2, and b4. But here we're probably likely to simply transpose to positions where we saw a4 later. We play a5, and if knight e1, knight d7, we've just transposed to the immediate knight e1 variation. White could try slightly different approach with b3. The idea we've seen before with bishop a3 to play b4, take back with the bishop, when the bishop is on a good square to threaten c5, and also after b6 play a5. That's kind of white's idea, to try and exchange these pawns as fast as possible. But it's not really working. We can just drop back. Again, I prefer the e8 square over d7 because white's knight is still on f3, so the knight g5 isn't as problematic. But here, h5 is also interesting. Getting ready to hop into f4. Just don't go to d7. White gets in b4. And we've had a logical sequence of moves, and white can be happy. Apart from the fact that now if you compare it with the bayonet, it turns out we're simply a tempo up, because white's had to play b4 in 2 goes. Other than that, we've got the same. We had this position in the bayonet chapter, but it was white's play there. Now we've got an extra tempo. We could go c5 or f5 to use it, but we could also just have an improved version of all of our bayonet lines with king h8 and just refer back to the bayonet attack for details of this position, but it's simply a better version with our king in the corner. Then those are probably the most sensible moves other than the main move that we'll cover in this video, which is bishop g5, the so-called Odessa variation. White has a few other tricky things we can check. h3 is odd. I always find it an odd combination to castle and play h3, because the main point of playing h3 is really to play g4 and set up some bind on the king side, which you're not going to do when you've castled king side. Here, the point is to play bishop e3 without allowing knight g4, but it's a bit slow. This time we can go to d7. Of course, the rule is to put the knight on e8, but we break it in this circumstance. h3 is a wasted tempo, and we're actually, because white hasn't fought for anything on the queen side, we're ready to play a5 and knight c5 very quickly. h3 is not helping in the fight for playing b4 at all. So bishop e3 is the logical follow-up. a5. We're getting ready to play knight c5. If our knight is already on c5, then we don't need to worry about knight g5s at all when we play f5, because we've already got adequate control of the e6 square. White has tried knight d2, but this is, in theory, this is white's ideal setup. But the pawn on h3 is very, very odd. Like in those lines of in the castle 9, knight e1, I mentioned that h3 was tried as an old move to slot g4, but that I didn't rate it there at all. Here it's even worse. One, because white is committed to it way too early, but secondly, that the knight on d2 is not actually helping. It's on a nice looking square, but it doesn't coordinate with h3. There you wanted h3 and knight on f2 to control the g4 square. That was white's idea, just trying to hold up the g4 break. The knight on d2 is absolutely useless in the fight on the king side. So the whole plan doesn't work for white. Once again, we can move the king. Here the idea is to play knight g8 and bishop h6, emphasizing quite how bad h3 is. White's created a huge hole on the g3 square. So he needs to keep dark square bishops. Bishop d3 was a slightly odd move. The idea is to play ef5 and put some pressure on that pawn if we go knight g8. But we're going to get another tempo in the race with that bishop move. We're following a fairly recent correspondence game, but white is already in a lot of trouble here. I think you know what our moves are. We're going to play knight f6, rook g8, bishop h6 or f8, depending if white is breaking with c5, cd yet, and g4. And white wasn't able to hold even in the email game. So knight d2 is kind of the strategy, but it's too slow with this weakened kingside with h3. White needs to be extremely careful moving pawns in front of this king, because our pawn storm is coming. a3 is more sensible, fighting for the control of the c5. But once again, we start with king h8. It just keeps a bit more control. It's useful. We definitely want to play king h8 in the structure once we've played f5 and knight g5 to e6 has happened, and where we take because of the tricks white has down the a2 j8 diagonal. So we might as well play it at this point. And after before f5, knight g5, knight f6, we've got our setup. The pawn h3 is useless here, and white's knight e6 jump doesn't achieve anything here. It's just going to create a weakness, and so white's whole opening strategy has failed. So h3 is not very impressive. Another bizarre move on the king side is king h1, which is an old Tony Miles special, the first English GM. Now, white is trying to stay flexible, but one key point is that if we play on autopilot with knight d7, white wants to play g4, and he can support this pawn with rook g1. He's been able to play g4 immediately, compared to the other lines we saw where the knight dropped back to e1 or d2 and f3 g4. So white's got a souped up version here, and white's already ready for a fight on the g file if we play f5 with an exchange and rook g1. So this is white's trick with king h1. So don't allow it. There are various moves we can play, but copying with king h8 is a good one. Here we're very likely to transpose to main lines, but ones where we've both included a king into the corner. Now king h8 for us is almost always useful, as you've seen. Our king is safer on h8. We have access to the g8 square now for potential bishop h6s or improving our knight, as well as putting the rook on the g file when we've made the pawn storm with f5, f4, g5. And it's extremely rare that white wanted to play king h1 himself. So the addition of these two moves should just be favourable. White's most common continuation is a4 here, but we'll just play a5. And I just don't actually understand why the king is better on h1 here rather than g1. And we're ready to play a knight round to c5 and play f5. I think our position is already very pleasant. Knight e1. And here g4 would try and make use of the king shunt in the corner, but actually after f5, f3, we've transposed to the knight e1 sidelines, where white played an early g4, where I recommend f4. White again isn't in time because his king is already in the corner to erect that bind with h4 and knight g2. Because the king, it just takes too long to evacuate white's king to the center of the board. So possibly the best way of playing, or at least the most challenging, would be to try f4 here and say at least that is useful putting the king in the corner. But we'll play exactly the same way as we did with kings back on g8 and g1. f3 is just very risky. After f4, we'll play our normal stuff. The king is definitely useful on h8, and it's very questionable, but it's probably just worse, the king on h1. We're at least a tempo ahead, because king h1 hasn't helped, but probably more. White could take, but both recaptures are good here. Laurent Fresinet won a nice game by taking with a knight, but g takes, as usual, would be my choice probably. If in doubt, take back with the pawn. So white can try f4, but we play exactly the same way as we did with kings on g1 and g8, with e takes f4. Now knight takes f4, we've got a nice outpost with knight c5, rook takes, knight e5, and this rook looks very odd on f4. After knight takes, we'll recapture the bishop, force that rook to retreat. And if the bishop takes, we again can go for this plan, giving up our pride and joy bishop, but winning a pawn in the process. And the one thing that's important to remember is that we can react to g4 with g5, and so white isn't getting in with bishop h6 and queen d4, which would otherwise be scary. White could try queen c1 to stop g5, but we'll play h5 at this point and stop g4. So we keep our knight on f5, which is doing a good defensive job, and white doesn't have enough play here for the pawn. The knight on b4 is still a long way from being a useful piece, and we can just shore up our position a bit. King h7, knight c5, bishop d7. We can develop happily with our extra pawn. What else? Queen c2 is a sideline that Pavel Avdianov has tried a few times. His idea is to put the rook on d1. Once again, we have quite a few choices, but with a knight on f3, let's be consistent and stay to my rule and go knight e8. Now rook d1 is the most consistent. White has tried some other things, but for bishop d2, we just play f5. And once again, we can choose. Any recapture is okay. Let's take with the pawn with a fine position. White has also tried b4, which is a weird bayonet hybrid. But knight e8 was a useful move for us, and queen c2, it's not so clear whether it is or not. Now we could play on the queen side with a5 here, but we can also just get on with it with f5. In this, the fight that's always happening when we go f5 of knight g5 into e6, b4 isn't actually helping at all. We might even lose some time because we'll go knight c6, attacking the pawn on b4 and threatening to jump into d4. And so we can happily play b4 here. We can happily play f5 here against b4. For example, knight g5, f4. Once again, this theme. Once again, it works because the knight is hanging on g5, so we're threatening knight takes d5, and there's no bishop g4 because the queen has moved away from d1 already. So these two reasons that we can play f4 without white having committed to f3. And knight e6, it doesn't work, but it's the only logical follow-up. We exchange, hitting the pawn on b4 and ready to jump into d4. The e6 pawn is dropping and there's no counterplay here. We're just going to be a pawn up. So rook d1 is more challenging. Now f5 is risky because white has some pressure down the d file after knight g5 to e6. Rather than this b4 pawn weakness, white is going to be faster with c5 with the pin. So we'll wait with a5, prevent white from playing b4 and c5, and ask him how he's going to continue. For example, rook b1 to go a3 and b4. And again, let's prevent knight g5 to e6 here because white's quite well placed for that fight. And just play h6. And next we'll play f5 with our usual stuff on the king side. Knight back to f6. Then white will have to watch out for fe4 as well, because the queen will be skewered after knight e4, queen e4, bishop f5, with that rook hanging on b1. So we're actually quite a lot faster than normal once white's committed to a queen on c2 and rook on b1. But it's a tricky idea, queen c2, and it's got the blessing of 2700 Grandmaster. So should we take it seriously? Some other random moves here. Rook e1. Very vague. Rook e1 makes sense. For example, if we're going to go knight h4. For example, in the bayonet attack, b4 main line, knight h5, rook e1 is the main move there, so that knight f4 can be met by bishop f1. So it makes absolute sense if we've got knight h5. But if we just go back to e8 like normal, then I'm not really sure that the rook is that useful on e1. For example, b4, a5, we can just play a bayonet attack where white has committed to rook e1, so, whereas we're playing all of our usual moves. And yeah, in fact, this position would be a mainline bayonet if the rook were back on f1 and bishop on a3. Bishop a3 would be threatening something with bishop b4 move the rook in c5. But rook e1 doesn't actually threaten anything. We could play a few moves, for example, b6, bayonet attack style, but we can also get on with it here with f5. And again, with knight g5, we're not too worried. We have this different approach we haven't seen yet, but it works well here. Bishop f6 with the idea, first of all, we're threatening to win a pawn. We're threatening knight takes d5. The rook's doing a good job on a5, so you can't recapture with check, and then the knight is hanging on g5. But also, the point is that we've vacated the g7 square. So after the exchange, knight g7, and we're ready to grab this pawn. The only way to actually keep the pawn is to go bishop h6 and use that pin. But giving up the dark square bishop is always a big concession. So we can be very happy. Like a lot of these sidelines. So that is rook e1, which makes sense if the knight were on h5, but doesn't make sense if we've not committed to knight h5. In fact, it's extremely rare that I'm recommending to go knight h5 in this course. Normally we're going normally we're going to d7 because we want to control c5. And if we're worried about knight g5, we're going to e8. Rook b1 is preparing the bayonet, so it makes some sense. a5. Now a3 would be the sensible move. But I could switch back to the 9 knight e1 style of playing. But we can play our usual stuff. It's exactly the same plan. b4 here doesn't really make sense because we'll take on b4 and white won't be able to fight for the c5 square. So white needs to play a3 first, so he can go b4, so he can get c5, so he can actually carry out his plan. But it's quite slow. Next we'll play knight f6 and h5. Perhaps a5 is a slight weakness we wouldn't want normally, but white is going to be too slow to get in at our d6 pawn here anyway. Our attack is coming much too fast. So a3 is a more sensible move. Now we should drop back to e8 because the knight is still on f3, and because we're never going to be able to get to c5 with that knight, because white is going b4. So e8 makes more sense. b4, swap and f5 with a usual kind of position. Again, we'll return with knight f6 next. There are some similarities to the 992 line, but white has achieved b4. It's going to be hard to get in c5 because his centre's a bit wobbly. We'll take on e4 and the d5 pawn is loose. a3 is very similar to rook b1, but an even slower way. If you compare, well, we can just play a5 and transpose, but we can also go knight e8. When the position to b4, white would rather have a rook on b1 here rather than the pawn on a3 as a trade-off. We can just get on with it. Our usual moves. And this is another similar position to the classical with 9 knight d2, where white is almost a transposition. White has managed to get in b4. It's not quite a transposition because we haven't had to play a5. White wasted a tempo with a3, so we didn't see the need. But it's going to be hard for white to make a move. c5 is his idea, and he might have some tactics down the a2 g8 diagonal against our king to justify it. So we do the same sidestep, make sure c5 is not playable, and the plans are the same as in the classical 992. Couple more random white tries. Knight h4, extravagant but playable, was Vigoriso's suggestion about it, but we can just continue normally. Knight e8. Now we're attacking the knight. d7 would also be possible for the knight, but here e8 is useful concretely because we're defending the pawn on c7, so we're threatening knight takes d5. With the knight on d7, white would be able to recapture queen takes h4 and then knight takes c7. But knight is defending that pawn, so knight takes d5 is the threat. So the knight needs defending. Going back to f3 would have no sense at all. But here we use another bonus to not putting the knight on d7, develop the bishop, and f5. And we're very quick again. Finally, c5. doesn't work, we just take it. When knight takes e5 fails to the typical King's Indian trick, especially in the exchange variation, delayed exchange, we'll see this more. With knight takes e4, we're hitting the knight on e5, and knight takes f7 will fail to knight takes c3 because white's queen is also attacked, so it just loses the piece. Finally, we'll have a look at the Odessa variation with bishop g5. Now this one is very controversial. White is trying to give up the dark squared bishop to get rid of our f6 knight. By losing the knight on f6, we lose some control of the e4 pawn, or the fight for the e4 square in total, and it's a bit slower, therefore, to get any counterplay. For example, we'll play f5, and eventually we'll have to move the bishop back after white exchanges on f6. So bishop back to g7, play f5, but we're not actually threatening anything yet there because we're missing the knight on f6. The knight on e7 takes a long time to get into the game. Therefore, I think we should just prevent white's plan. Play knight e8. h5 is possible too, and it's more common, but it's a bit harder to break with f5 when the knight is on h5, because e takes f, gf, and our knight is hanging on h5 to some knight takes e5 tricks. So we'll just keep the knight away on e8, and we're ready to push with f5. Now white doesn't really want to give up the bishop for the e7 knight because it doesn't slow our play in the center in the slightest. We're going f5 and knight f6, and immediately there's pressure on this pawn on e4. Now queen d2 is often played, but I don't understand the point. We attack the bishop, and he can exchange bishops, and we'll force the exchange. But all white has done is spend some time to exchange off his good bishop for our bad bishop once the center is closed like this. And we've kick-started our attack. Our knight's ready to come to g6. Won't be ready to play g4 and f5. The knight landing on f4. Our attack is just very fast compared to normal. So I don't understand what the logic is behind queen d2, other than the sort of autopilot's thought that against a thin-shattered bishop, it's good for a bishop on h6. Once again, white needs to understand the King's Indian quite well to be able to face it. Play bayonet style, but after h6, hitting this bishop. Once it drops back, f5, and we just gained a tempo. h6 is a useful move to stop the knight coming into g5. It's unclear why white has had to put the bishop on g5 first. Knight d2 is the main move, and we push with f5. What we shouldn't do this time is attack the bishop. With the knight moved already from f3, if we play f6, bishop e3, and then f5, white can play f3, and he's got that good coordination and the ideal setup that he's going for. The one that we've been trying to avoid. We allowed it with the pawn on h3 because that was too big a concession. But here, that's just the line to be aware of. So I'll go f5 immediately. Now f3 is thematic, but risky. It's safer to take this pawn. Now both knights are controlling the e4 square. Let's just stop the knights being able to use it. Now f4 is a typical way to diffuse our initiative. If f4 is not played, we can consider it ourselves. Probably preceded by bishop f6. Also, you can play f4 first and then bishop f6, exchange those bishops, and then knight f5 to d4. We've seen that route is very good for the knight. So f4 is more sensible. e4, and this is a relatively common structure from various King's Indians. Now white wants to land his knight in to d4 and e6. So we should stop it with c5. Now, if white just leaves this structure, the knight is really misplaced on b3. It's controlling the d4 square, but it's doing nothing else. And we'll be able to combine attacking down the g file with preparing b5. So rook b8, a6, and b5, blowing white away. It's a very nice position where we can attack on both sides of the board. So you should take, and we have a fairly thematic position, but one that should be quite good for us Again, this knight on b3 is bad. We can play bishop to e6, develop our pieces normally, rook b8, and put some pressure down the b file. And it's not really clear what white's whole plan is here. So f3 is more thematic. And now I like to play f4. So we've got an odd version of the classical variation where the bishop has hopped from c1 or f2 to g5. Probably it would normally be on f2. And actually he's got a problem. We're threatening to play bishop f6, exchanging off our bishop. Often we spend a lot of time with king h8, knight g8, bishop h6 to force this bishop exchange. And here white has done the job for us. After bishop f6, bishop h6, the bishop's unlikely to stay on the board very long and go rook f7, king h8, and knight g8, the bishop's trapped. But for example, if b4, bishop f6, so yeah, bishop h6, rook f7, and king h8, knight g8, and that's the bishop. But take, and the exchange has helped an awful lot. Just in general, we're happy to exchange off these dark square bishops because ours is blocked in by pawns. But also concretely, we're very fast with something like g5, rook round to g7 and g4 here. So double bonus. Without that dark square bishop, white will succeed in c5, but he'll struggle to get much further on the king, over on the queen side with his attack. So white should run away with this bishop. When I like king h8, it's a sophisticated move. Like generally king h8 is useful. If in doubt in these Plata variations, you understand your pieces all seem to be on perfect squares, preventing white's plan, then king h8 works well. But here we also have a sneaky idea in mind. After b4, g5. It's a good pawn sacrifice. Now if white declines it with putting the bishop on f2, then white's just a long way behind in the normal race. That bishop normally would have spent 2 tempi to get to f2, bishop e3 to f2. Now it's gone to g5 to h4 to f2, so white has lost a tempo. And we've played all of our usual moves. Again, an extra tempo is very important in these counter-attacking lines where both sides are throwing everything they've got at each other. But taking the pawn on g5 is not very helpful either. Again, white has to allow this exchange of bishops. Bishop h6, rook g8 to g6 is going to collect that bishop. And here we've got a very, very powerful version of the typical classical Plata attacks. The rook's ready to swing to h6, knight g6, and queen h4. White may have an extra pawn, but that just means we've got an extra open line towards white's king. Without those dark square bishops, I think it's going to be incredibly hard to defend. So that wraps up our coverage of the classical, basically. We've got a couple of little things to look at with the delayed exchange and the exchange, but this is the proper classical fights. We're in the Mar del Plata variation. There are a lot of different moves that white can try here, as we've seen, but normally they just reach worse versions of the main lines for white, and there's a reason that they're not often played. I think you should be very happy if you face them, even if you can't remember the exact refutations featured in this course. If you can just remember that, as a general rule, when the knight's on f3, white's hoping to annoy us with knight g5 and into e6, so our knight belongs on e8. Then I think that will cover 90% at least of the stuff seen in this video. Thanks a lot for watching. See you soon. Cheers.